And if, Mr. Clerk, if you could scroll down to the last email on this page, or sorry, in this document, it'll be on the next page. And this is an email dated February 9th from Mr. Stravas to you, subject line ABRFA. And if you scroll down to the text, please, Mr. Clerk, you'll see the text on the letter itself. John Broadhead and I spoke, and I think we revised the response about exhausting provincial resources and enforcing contracts and laws. And we look forward to learning more on that front. So it's not a no, just more context. Now, I understand Mr. Broadhead is the Director of Policy in the PMO. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you know what the reference to "it's not a no" is about?
I believe I do. I was very concerned when I heard back from the Deputy Minister and the Canadian Armed Forces that they did not have the equipment that Minister MacGyver had requested in his request for assistance. And so I asked my staff and public safety to explore other areas of government to see if there was any way that we could provide assistance to Alberta. And we looked, for example, in other federal departments. We looked outside the country in Montana. We were looking for any way that if the CAF equipment was not appropriate or available, we were looking to see if there was any alternative that we could help Alberta with.
All right, thank you. At ssm.can.nsc 402689. This was a record that Commission Counsel put to you earlier today. And I'll ask the clerk to please pull that up. The version that you saw today was unredacted, and I understand that that was only recently supplied. And when we review this, this is an email from, again, your Chief of Staff on February 11th. If we scroll down, we see an email from Rady Barrick to you on February 11th. Within the next page, we see a response. Further, I understand that Alberta has the required legal authorities necessary to enforce compliance as a highway is considered essential infrastructure, and it goes on. There are a number of contraventions or other applicable legislation that may also be enforced by Alberta and its police forces. So at that point in time, the reason for rejecting Alberta's RFA was, in fact, that the position of Government of Canada was that Alberta had the required legal authorities. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you could read down through the entire letter, because I want to see how this is dealt with. And I think it's also, it's relevant that in the last paragraph where the letter also refers to the lack of commercial resources, the Canadian Armed Forces being the only federal asset, and discussions that make clear that CAF have neither the type of assets required nor the expertise to do this without significant possible risk. So it was an answer to Minister MacGyver's specific request for tow trucks belonging to CAF. And it was, I think it was an important context for this letter as well.
But certainly also the position of Canada was that Alberta still had authorities that it could exercise to deal with the blockade at Coots, correct? There
is some reference to that in this letter, yes.
Okay, thank you. And if we scroll down to the last paragraph in the letter, there's reference there to the use of federal resources may be reconsidered at a future date once all other provincial options and capabilities have been exhausted. What was meant by that?
Well, again, we were also examining across all of government. We were also talking about the possibility of providing funding to assist them in acquiring through private and commercial means the vehicles that they required.
But of course, contingent on all other provincial options and capabilities having been exhausted, correct?
Well, and again, not just exhausted or unlikely to succeed. I think that's a reasonable consideration as well. I think we were trying to communicate. My concern, quite frankly, is I felt a necessity to reply to Minister MacGyver, who had made a request to give him the information. He very specifically asked for something, and we were saying no. And I think, as you saw in the email above this, I was concerned that we weren't able to say yes, but I was also concerned that we needed to reply to his letter.
And that reference, of course, is to at the very top when you approve this response, is the response to go to Alberta.
Yep.
And then I'll ask you, Mr. Clerk, to please go up to the top. There's a reference to has the PMO approved? And I take the PMO to be the Prime Minister's office. Is that correct?
That's the usual, that acronym represents the Prime Minister's office.
For sure. And was it a requirement that the Prime Minister's office approve a response to an RFA?
No, not normally, but clearly there was communication between the offices because there's also an issue of intergovernment affairs between ourselves and the provinces. I think there was a complexity to this request because it involved a number of different ministries, and it was an unusual outcome because we always try to find a way to say yes.
Do you know if the Prime Minister's office ever did approve a response to Alberta's RFA?
I have no knowledge of that. I'm not involved in those communications.
All right. There is reference in the records to your chief of staff arranging a February 9th meeting with the Prime Minister to discuss the RFA. Were you aware of those discussions?
No.
Okay, thank you. I am over my time. I would ask the indulgence of the Commissioner for a couple more minutes just to touch on two more things, please.
Okay, go ahead, but try and make it fast. Everyone's been
For
over,
sure.
with one exception, as I recall.
All right, Mr. Clerk, could you please pull up document ssm.nsc.can 403164? And this is an email dated February 17th from you to your Chief of Staff, Minister Blair.
Yes.
I'll have you scroll down a little bit to that second email. It says, Zita, this letter from Alberta is incredibly helpful. They are asking for federal assistance. They say they've exhausted all existing authorities and resources. They are practically begging for us to help. We should think about publishing this. I'll take it this is reference to the February 5th RFA that your office received from Minister McIver. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. You wanted this letter to be published as support for Government of Canada's invocation of the Emergencies Act, correct?
My intention was that it would be published because we were putting documentary evidence before Parliament. There was an ongoing parliamentary debate and there was a vote scheduled for the following week. And my recommendation, because specifically Minister McIver had talked about the RCMP exhausting, the language isn't in front of me, but I believe his letter said all of their resources and options. And I thought that was particularly relevant to the discussion around the invocation of the Act.
But you were also aware prior to the invocation of the Act of Alberta's success in purchasing tow equipment, correct?
I was aware that they'd purchased tow equipment. I also was aware that it had become somewhat moot because after the investigation by the RCMP, the seizure of weapons and the arrest of a number of individuals, the blockade that existed at Coots, most of those people skedaddled.
All right, thank you. One last record to put before you. That's PB.can 401132. And this is an appearance that a transcript of an appearance you had on Global News on February 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And if you scroll down, please, Mr. Clerk, to page 2. There's a question from Mercedes Stevenson. You can see it now just at the bottom of your screen. Are you prepared to invoke the Emergencies Act?
It's not on the bottom of my screen, but
sorry, can you scroll down there, please, Mr. Clerk? There it is there. And your response is, certainly, I will tell you the Emergencies Act has been under a very fulsome consideration right from the first day as to what needs to be done. When you refer to right from the first day, what day are you talking about?
Actually, my responsibility as the Minister of Emergency Preparedness is to examine every federal authority and resource that can be brought to bear. As I've earlier testified, I'd actually examined the use of this particular act during the pandemic and determined that the threshold was not met. And throughout this event, I was aware of this and many other legislative options available to us. And so it was something that we were prepared to examine, but as you can see in my answer, a more fulsome answer, below that, I was very clear that our work with the provinces was important, and I talked about the Ontario steps that they had taken with their own emergency act. And as I believe they said, we will see if their effectiveness is sufficient to bring the situation in Ontario under control. And as I've said, I don't believe that we had at the time of this discussion on the Sunday morning reached that decision. And I was indicating that we were prepared to look at every option.
But you'll agree, your answer was that it was under very fulsome consideration. So it's not just a background option. It's something that you were seriously considering, correct?
What I was attempting to convey is that every option was on the table, and we were prepared to examine every option and then to do what was required to bring about a peaceful resolution of these blockades.
I understand that you did
I'm going to have to say that you're now more than double your time. So one last question is all I'll allow.
All right. You will agree with me that by speaking on news programs on February 13th, you made the public aware that the federal government was considering the Emergencies Act, correct?
I anticipated that the public was expecting their government to consider every option to bring about a peaceful resolution to these protests, because it was hugely impactful, not just to the people of Ottawa and the communities impacted, but to the entire country.
All right. Thank you very much for answering my questions today, Minister Blair.
Thank you very much.
Okay, the province of Saskatchewan